So right now, Riot has us voting on 5 champions to decide which one of them will get a gameplay rework for the next year. The 5 champions are Volibear, Fiddlesticks, Mundo, Shyvana, and Nocturne. I'm surprised it's just these 5, since we all know a few others need it, but whatever. Oh dear. Anyhow, these champions have been around since forever, and they have all been junglers at some point, or are still junglers, and thus I have some history with knowing their ups and downs and all that nonsense. With that said, I have actually spoken in length about the problems these champions faced in their respective videos, but I'll recap on all of them in this video, and I'll put out the champion I voted for at the very end. Honestly, they all need it, but one towers above all of them in how badly he needs it, though ironically there is another who needs it even more than these 5. Oh dear, but again, they're not gonna bother with you, dear. First up is Nocturne. In basically every video I decide to speak about this issue with him, it's basically the same thing. He is too fair. When he came out, he was insanely strong because he had a lot of tools at his disposal, and he was one of the first champions to be released with a more clear, focused goal in mind. Up until that point, Riot sort of made champions with low ideas of how to fit them in the meta. That said, Nocturne being fair comes from all these tools that he was given having some sort of counterplay attached to them, and that counterplay doesn't rely on specific items or abilities. Essentially, you'll see what I mean by the time I'm done explaining every ability. Everything Nocturne does has a channel in some sort of way. His sphere is the most obvious one, with the channel made clear with visuals and sound effects. It's even further made counterplayable by the fact that it has a short range, it can be broken by leaving its range, and it is targeted, which means it is dependent on vision. His W blocks a spell entirely, which is really strong, but it has such a short window to do so that it can be duped out, or if the player just fails to utilize it properly, it just doesn't do anything. His Q requires you to actually hit the target with it to potentially maximize the secondary effects of it, as not fighting on the Shadow Trail makes you weaker overall. Even his ultimate is fairer than most since it has a channel time attached to it depending on how much you want to exploit it. Basically, you have an activation animation, and then your channel time is how far you are traveling, which makes farther distances let the enemy sort of prepare for you, and even then, Nocturne's ultimate is announced to the enemy team that they at least have some semblance of preparation for it. So with that said, Nocturne's biggest problem is that he's too fair, and he's either outdone by newer champions that have broken things attached to them like Camille, or they are forced to overtune him, which makes all these seemingly fair things become super overbearing and honestly harder to deal with. Fiddlesticks is an easy one to talk about. He's basically a weird mess of things that somehow work together but aren't actually fun for the enemy to deal with. He has arguably the strongest crowd control in the game in the form of his Q, which is a ranged targeted instant hard control, which just shuts anyone down. He has a health drain in his W, which will beat anyone who can't stop it or kill him through it. His E basically trolls entire teams with random bounces of silence, and it is his highest offending ability due to the RNG, and his ultimate is a really strong sustained AoE damage spell that is easy to interrupt and negate entirely, but it just works, and if it works, it will absolutely melt everyone. Fiddlesticks' main problem is really that he's just super janky. Things are just kind of all over the place with him. But nothing's more all over the place with him than his matchups. Fiddlesticks has some of the weirdest matchups in the game because there are individual champions that can hound him, but he can even beat them if they let him get away with his early game, and even then his team composition matchups vary violently. The best way to summarize Fiddlesticks is that he's a champion that works in violent degrees. There is no real middle ground with him. He's either a colossal menace in the game and can't be stopped, or basically near worthless with the exception of his crowd control. Changes to the game will cause him to change wildly too, as he doesn't play by the rules like other champions do. Riot has been wanting to dramatically change him since forever, but it's risky since salvaging anything of his current abilities will be paper-thin imitations most likely. Basically, Fiddlesticks is like this. Either the entire enemy team works together to deal with him, and even just the minor things they can do can shut him down entirely in some situations, or they ignore him and they just completely lose, and that's not really that fun. And even if they ignore him, some of the RNG nonsense that Fiddlesticks can pull off can just turn the game anyways, so it's just not fun. It's pretty much the reason why he's gonna get reworked. Oh, Dr. Mundo, one of the trolliest, most fun champions in the game that is totally jank in terms of balance and with a pretty outdated kit. The best way I can describe him is when you're attempting to grab a greased up pig, do you have a towel? If no, then you can't catch him and he's gonna knock over all your furniture. Dr. Mundo is basically a walking mass of stats that just walks at people and wails on them until they die or kill him. But the problem is that he's hard to kill without the right tools, and even sometimes, especially when he gets buffed, the tools aren't working that well. That's kind of the only way you can summarize this champion. He either runs you over or just does nothing. On a different standpoint, he's a very value-intensive champion. He's an aggro tank that multiplies the value of health in comparison to other champions. Basically, all you need to do is buy and amass health on him, and his abilities become stronger, his survivability skyrockets, and even his damage improves. This makes him far easier to equip than most junglers and champions, since gearing for health tends to be cheaper than anything else, and double with the fact that he's an entirely insanely fast jungler, he can get out of control if you don't check him. Also, while not being one of the biggest reasons, it's rather trolly that a super beefy tanky champion has one of the most powerful pokes in the game. Dr. Mundo can poke you with his cleaver all day and chunk anyone, including tanks, and even if you retaliate against them or initiate on him, it might not amount to anything or could even put your team in a bad spot. Dr. Mundo is the one that sort of shows this trend of earlier champions in that either you can deal with them 100% or you can't deal with them at all. Dr. Mundo is just insanely hard to deal with without the tools being strong, there being tools in the first place, and him himself not being at a state of incredible overbearingness. Now for Shyvana. This is where people will start getting mad, but Shyvana has always been a pretty trash champion. Yes, she's had times where she was insanely strong, but the dynamics of her gameplay are exceedingly poor. And yes, she was one of the champions who heralded the whole fast clearing the jungle thing, but that kind of didn't amount to much because Season 2 was pretty weird. Remember, none of these had anything to do with the champion ever being strong, viable, or used in competitive. These champions have all had issues with how crap their kids are and how they function very poorly, and Shyvana is one of the worst offenders in League at this. Essentially put, these champions have kids that didn't really evolve with the game. I have always described her as a champion that just beats you with her sack of gold. She's basically farm in champion form. Aside from her current AP build, which is flimsy at best, her entire gameplay revolves around charging at an enemy and just grinding them down. She's like Dr. Mundo, but with less tools at achieving this, but better tools at doing it. Basically an offensive version, as she can obliterate targets faster, but she's sometimes super embarrassing to see because she can't really reach her targets that easily. With that, we basically keep going in the same circles. Either Shyvana has the survivability and means to charge successfully at people and decimate them within a reasonable amount of farm time, or she doesn't, and she's worse than useless since she has no recovery mechanics. She's basically a feast or famine champion in a severe degree. At least Dr. Mundo can fall back on cleaver spam and has far more innate value with his kit and itemization. Shyvana is just screwed by being very goal dependent and having no flexibility in her playstyle. If you guys didn't figure this out already by the progress of the video or by having watched every video with Volibear in the past where I tear him apart, then what the hell? Straight out, Volibear is probably League's worst champion, period. Even in times that he's strong, it's only because something very exploitable exists, or his numbers are absolutely stupid, and even then, hilariously, he tends to be the first one to drop off when other champions start popping off with those same exploits. Volibear's main issues can be summarized really easily. His kit is super janky, super underwhelming, and it has insane counterplay despite it being bland in addition to being item dependent, at least more than most junglers should be, and he has no actual uses in game that are unique or even relevant. I used to say that he was one of the best, if not the best, bodyguards in the game, but that was never really a role or function in the game that was important, and even then, plenty of other champions do bodyguard work in addition to other core functions. Even that bodyguard thing for Volibear has been taken away from him by Maokai and Poppy, so now he really doesn't have anything. As far as his abilities go, his Q is super weak and janky in that it is easy to screw it up during a clusterfuck and it's barely even good as anything. It can technically initiate fights, but Volibear has to flash or crawl his fat ass towards a target, and it's pretty damn telegraphed. Yes, in ideal situations like having Predator or other speed buffs, it could be stronger, but other initiations will work better with less hassle, so let's not assume golden situations here. His W is just terrible in so many ways. He's a melee champion with no mobility outside of his Q, so making him have to slash people a few times to be able to activate his nuke is pretty jarring, alongside the fact that it's an execution that he can't really spam to assist him in chunking people down. His E used to be mediocre garbage, now it's actually pretty good, an AoE mini knockup that can interrupt people and almost be spammed. It is literally his only good ability, but it's not enough to make up for the rest of his kit. His ultimate is the worst offender. It can deal tons of damage if the enemy decides to stand still, or you get to scratch a tank and hope the bounces are effective. You activate Volibear's ultimate, and now you have to be able to stick to a target and auto-attack them. Usually Volibear will get knocked away, his target will bounce away somehow, or Volibear will just get killed. Yes, theoretically it works because Volibear will charge in and initiate, and the fight will break out, but he can scratch at any target and have his bounces be effective, and he can do all sorts of AoE damage, but that requires everything else to work out for him, and like I stated earlier, it's one of those situations of why go through the hassle with Volibear and not just someone easier and better. It can best be summarized as this: the amount of things you can do to prevent Volibear from doing whatever he wants to do is so massive in comparison to the reward you would get of even making it work. So it's pretty much pointless. There's no reason to use him. And Volibear gets worse and worse as the game progresses because his kit has very little flexibility, function, and form. If you didn't vote for Volibear, you either personally hate one of the other 4 champions, or you forgot Volibear existed and forgot how much saving this guy needs, or you couldn't vote for Udyr.